I just wanted to say welcome again, everyone. Super excited to get started today, and thank you for joining us today. Just a quick introduction. My name is Andrew. I'm over at Customer Success at Assembly AI, and as you may already know, Assembly AI is an API platform that has AI models to help you ship AI-powered features super fast. Today, we're going to be talking with Grain and how they're building using AI to generate powerful insights for their customers. But first, just get started with a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during the conversation, please ask them in the QA box at any time. If you need to, you can also adjust the audio settings at the bottom left of your control panel. And finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll send you the recording tomorrow. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce Mike Adams. Mike, welcome.
Hey, Andrew. Nice to be here.
Pleasure. It's nice to have you here. Super excited to get started. Really, I think a great way to kick everything off would be really just learning more about, Grain, what it is that Grain does, and how it got started.
Yeah, sure. So what we do is turn conversations into useful content that people use for lots of different use cases. I would say we probably have three main buckets. A lot of people use Grain for sales calls, updating their deal notes so they don't have to manually do all of that work, and it's more accurate and better record keeping. The second one is a lot of product research and insight. So founders and product leaders and designers and user researchers will use Grain to capture all the information during a conversation so that they don't have to rely as much on their manual note taking, and then they can go back and reference individual points. And kind of the core user experience that people have loved from the beginning of Grain is that the ability to clip highlights from the transcript in seconds using drag and drop. And then those become independent links that can embed inside of Salesforce or Slack or Notion or whatever they may be. So you're kind of automatizing these 30-minute calls down into the 30 seconds that matters and collaborating around that. And then the third one is a lot of, I would say, support and kind of success-oriented folks that are trying to make sure that the people that they're serving, that's trying to help to be successful, that they're learning as much as possible from those and identifying follow-up items and the record keeping, for the next conversation. So that's a little bit about kind of Grain, who uses it and why. The backstory of how it got started is I was actually talking to one of the earliest Zoom users about this last week. He reached out and booked a demo call for Grain, and we were talking through that it seems very, just kind of table stakes now, but I was in the education space back in 2013, and one day one of our students, we had an in-person program, and one of our students couldn't show up. They had visa issues, and they were just begging us to walk around the classroom with a laptop open and a Google Hangouts room. And miraculously, they learned and got a great outcome and were able to get the job. And that kind of sparked a thing where we're like, what if we just did an entire cohort, on Meet? And we did, and it was a disaster because mostly the reliability just didn't work, and there was no way to ensure that people could learn in large group settings if they couldn't hear each other and they couldn't see each other. And so then we looked around at what other options there were, and there was this little startup called Zoom that obviously everybody knows now, but that what they really solved is the infrastructure on lack of reliability that Meet and Teams, there was no Teams at the time, but Meet in particular and WebEx didn't ever really solve. And that fundamentally changed, I would say, the business model of how we could teach and educate. So I started my second company, I would say, in the heels of that experience. And my premise was that every single conversation now is data. All of our lectures are data. All of our admissions interviews are data. All of our team meetings are data. Because you moved from this analog world where it'd be super awkward to pull out your phone and try to record people, to a world where the student could go back to the part of the lecture that they were confused by, leaving a little bookmark behind. And so we built our own technology to manage the recordings from Zoom that we were just recording to the cloud, and manage access so that students got access to the right ones, and the staff got access to the right one. And we got acquired in 2018 by WeWork. And it was kind of like the wild west of a lot of different reasons for that acquisition. But ultimately the school didn't continue, And I didn't have a strong desire to work at WeWork for reasons that I think became obvious a little bit later. And I knew that there was a real opportunity to build software that we built for ourselves to solve our own problem as this, I would say, behavior change of shifting every conversation that can go to the digital format will go to the digital format. And so that was like the first slide in my deck in 2018 when we started Grain. And then we iterated for about a year on a lot of different ideas. I can go into detail on that if it's useful, but in the end, COVID hit and we had just kind of thrown away a year's worth of code and started over, where we really focused on, I would say, identifying and clipping these moments that matter. And there was just a huge amount of resonance, especially in a COVID world, around like, yes, this is what I've wanted, is the ability to share what they said here and not have to point them to, the hope that they find their way through this giant, unnavigable, unstructured recording. So we've been kind of building off that for the last few years. And I would say over the last 6 months or so, we've been moving from a lot of the user experiences that we relied on the user to kind of manually do, like flagging moments themselves. We've been increasingly leveraging large language models to do that identification and flagging and highlighting, clipping and summarization for them. And so that's kind of where assembly comes in as well.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. We'll dive into all of that as we move on. But I mean, just to echo, it's so different, especially you said in COVID, in today's world, when you're trying to convey, different messages that you're getting in different spheres, especially when you're remote. It's not, gone are the days in a lot of offices where you could kind of just go pop your head in someone's office and say, hey, we talked about this earlier, how do we want to handle X, Y, and Z? Now that gets a lot more difficult when you're talking about going through Slack channels, emails, whatever it may be, and just, having those highlights, those clips where it's just very clearly, hey, this is what we're speaking of, I think is super valuable. So that makes a ton of sense as to where that plays a role in today's environment. I couldn't agree more. And to that note, I'm kind of curious, you've already alluded to it in what you're doing with some AI-based features, but really as you start looking at the company as a whole, what would you say is differentiating Grain at this moment from other meeting insight tools or recording tools at this point in time?
Yeah, I mean, I would say over the last I think Gong had been around for 2 years. So they're like the kind of 800-pound gorilla in the sales vertical for conversation intelligence. And they did a lot of work with a couple of others to kind of define this idea of conversation intelligence. But that benefit has always been restricted just to sales. And so it's as expensive as a Salesforce seat. It's not something that like everybody in the team has access to in terms of the learnings and the content that's being generated. Oftentimes, and I would say the automation and that insight is definitely geared almost exclusively towards the things that sales folks would want to know, like what are the, when was my competitor mentioned, or these keyword trackers, and also a lot of like coaching. And so I would say we still serve those same needs, I would say, with Grain, but we've came up with more of the kind of 80-20 solution to where we don't go nearly as deep on those kind of fringe, I would say, applications specifically for sales, but we do cover, I would say, the 80-20 of what most sales folks want. But that 80-20 also is what product people want and team leaders want for their meetings and everybody else. So that, I would say, bringing the kind of the democratization of the access to this kind of category of technology that you can not only capture and create data from what otherwise was just an ephemeral set of conversation that if it were to be captured would be extremely valuable, but just before we moved to Zoom it was too weird, and now you have a tool to kind of capture that, but then also actually turn it into intelligence that can drive customer alignment, team alignment, and decision making. And so it's that kind of democratization, I would say, is a big thing that makes Grain different. And then the other is just where a lot of our users, it was actually a Grain clip that I wasn't even in the call. Someone sent on my team to me the other day. Was someone described Grain as undercomplicated. We just really focus on a clean, simple, pure UI that that gets the job done for the vast majority of people, and it doesn't try to do too much. And that ends up, I think, in a lot of ways being a strength of ours.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, especially when you talk about like the simplicity and ease of use. And AI can be a pretty complicated and product. So I'm kind of interested to understand like how you're bringing in AI to win the market, and maybe what have been some challenges there when you're integrating that type of technology.
Yeah, totally. So there's an interesting backstory here specifically about the product development journey of Grain is,
Mhm.
we recognize that there was this orientation to a timestamp in a call was super, super valuable. And that the first kind of innovation we did was this live annotation tool that would pop up and we'd move it back 5 seconds from when you marked. And so you take your note like you normally would, but we turn all those notes into like 30-second video clips that use the title of whatever note you took, and then they become, portable and shareable. That has been, I would say, the core experience that we launched with. In fact, we didn't even transcribe the whole call at the time when we launched. It was just the like 30 seconds before and after these like notes and these marks that you made.
Mhm.
And as time has gone on, we knew right away that our market opportunity was going to be a function of how easy it was to get to those little chunky moments and then collaborate with your team around them, add them to your kind of taxonomy or categorizing of customer insights or bugs or whatever it may be. And the easier we make that for the user, the more people who can use Grain, the more applicable Grain becomes. And in the earliest days of Grain, I would say we almost maybe over-indexed, frankly, on user experience and product researchers and product folks who had a lower frequency of say conversation than say a sales person. But what they did is they were able to listen during every call. And because we have this real-time annotation, you can't really make a highlight in the middle when you're talking. You have to do that when you're listening. And so for a couple of years, that was one of our guiding, focuses, was like, we're building this experience and making it awesome to get those nuggets for folks who have cognitive bandwidth during a conversation to actually do this annotation. But again, I think I mentioned it really, I would say, took a head of steam about 6 months ago. We've had access to OpenAI for a long time. But when ChatGPT came out into the world, everyone all of a sudden they were like, whoa, it can do that. And I can ask it anything that I want. And so we started, I would be doing a lot more investment on the prompt engineering to get to outcomes that would produce those insights, those moments that matter, without relying on the user to be, cognitively spending up that cognitive bandwidth while they're in the middle of conversation. And so it also opened up some of these other use cases to be even more applicable, like sales, where you tend to do a lot more talking. But the best sales folks all know that you should be doing more listening than talking. And so those are the ones that have, I think, always, embraced Grain, even when it had more of the kind of listening requirement. But that is, I would say, at the core of the automation that we've been doing, is kind of replacing or augmenting more so that live requirement to identify those important moments, to a little bit more of a self-driving experience that you can go back afterwards, review and kind of synthesize and turn into the highlights with, even if you didn't take the live notes.
Yeah, no, that's an extremely important piece when you start thinking about like what insights can you grab from a call. And you alluded to this at the beginning of, you started with those highlights, and then how do you do that in a way that you can open up bandwidth and really give focus to who you're talking to. And that's such a great idea that I would love to understand when you're starting to build with things like GPT and that type of technology. There's so much that's there. It's very
Yeah.
open. So going beyond like feature requests, how do you really kind of break down or decide to how you want to commit to an AI powered feature, how you build around it? Kind of curious around your thought process around something like that and that type of technology.
Yeah, we kind of have, I would say there's two levels that we break in all of the automation, large language work that we're doing. One level is, I would say, at the automation on an individual task. So that's the lowest hanging fruit of where our focus has been. And I would say that's most of the applications we're seeing in the market, not just Grain, but there's other products that are doing this. Even Microsoft Team has a lot of this, where what you're doing is replicating what you could do with a high school intern. You're like, or college intern, and you're like, hey, could go through my call, listen to it, and pull out this information and put it into this format. it doesn't take a genius to do that, right? But it does
Mhm.
take a lot of time, and it's expensive, and so most people don't. And so that's kind of level one is it's not even this like super intelligence. It's more like basic intelligence where you're just kind of really prescriptive about what the task is to kind of take it from this unstructured mess of a conversation that might have some speaker labels of who said what, and turning it into an output that's repeatable and useful and valuable. And the key is that it's accurate, that it's good. What
Yeah.
actually, gets output is not a bunch of gibberish. And that's where this space has been for a really long time. And so we've actively focused on not overbilling our AI powered X, Y, and Z, AI assistant, AI note taker. People have been saying this stuff for 4 or 5 years. And it was always kind of garbage output. And we felt like that was just going to like breach the trust of our users who have learned to, really, I would say, trust our marketing language to be accurate with what you can actually do with the product. But
Mhm.
over the last few months, it's been, I would say the last half year, it's gotten to the point to where it's like, oh, wow, like we can actually automate and summarize those things. And then the second half of the type of work that can be done is more across many different conversations, where historically you would have to do a similar kind of set of like, go rewatch all of these calls and identify the patterns and the themes, or identify, go watch all of this person's calls and identify the patterns and themes of how effective they are at the closing part of the call, or at the discovery aspects of their call. And now
Mhm.
you're in a world where you can automate that and do it in seconds. And while it's not going to necessarily be perfect, it's going to be pretty dang good. And most importantly, like a huge part of what I believe is, and we talked about this briefly in our kind of like pre-webinar, is what I
Mhm.
believe is really, really important is whether it's on that kind of individual conversation or in the aggregate. And the aggregate becomes even more important, is that there's always a link back to truth. Because large language models in particular that are driving technology to do this sort of synthesis analysis, they can hallucinate. It's very common for them to just make crap up. So we always, when we're working on functionality and features, we're always including the timestamp back to the original source that the AI is identified as being the thing that leads to the conclusion, the synthesis, and so that you can both use it as evidence as necessary, but also kind of like validate and back it up. Because we can talk more about that, I think, if we want to, but that second category becomes even more important to make sure that you're sourcing your work, and the prompt engineering will allow you to do that.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely that could definitely become a rabbit hole for sure. And I
Yep.
think it's super important that a company is thinking about that. It is a huge responsibility when you're talking about the content that you're putting out and the accuracy behind it. I think one thing that was interesting to me was you're looking at like how do these models work, and I think one point that's been brought up in the past is when you have like math, 4 digits multiplication, it's coming out with the wrong number in some cases.
Yeah.
And so it's like if you're not paying attention to that, or if you don't have someone who's really like a company like Grain who's really sitting down and thinking about like, okay, hey, we want to use this incredible technology to leap forward. We have to do so responsibly and in a way that like helps our users. And to do that, you have to have that accuracy or some source of truth that you can link back um, to really avoid situations like that. So it's great to hear that you're thinking about it for sure. But feel free to elaborate. I know it's an interesting topic, but at the same time, I'm sure we could spend the rest of the webinar speaking to that. By
We
all
could.
means.
I think the main point there is every piece of technology and every tool that's built is built with some philosophical underpinnings. And
Mhm.
I would say at Grain, I don't believe in artificial intelligence by the classical definition of like it's been marketed as artificial intelligence, and most of what it is statistical inference, right?
Mhm.
And I believe that um, especially over the next 5 years, it's going to change. It's already changed the world in the last 6 months, and it's just crazy
Yeah.
to think about the rate of change. But the role of AI is more augmented intelligence than artificial, in my personal opinion. And that's how, as designers and builders of products and tools, we should be thinking about it. Even whether it's synthesis across an entire call, that still isn't going to do the work to draw the conclusion and then just believe it undeniably and then go and make your product decision based on it. It can inform
Mhm.
your intuition, inform your decision making, and save you a huge amount of time. And but we have to be very, very careful of the bias that work can do as well, because depending on how you prompt, depending on how you set it up, it can produce something that I think the word, hallucination. It's like it can literally just make things up. So you have to be really careful. So when we're designing products, we're always trying to make sure that the output is going to be, I would say, largely representative of reality, and that you have to be really careful not to do any prompt engineering that it can encourage these large language models to make stuff up, because they will if you ask them to. And so I think that's like the biggest, I would say, philosophical underpinning of the products that are going to be built right now is like, do we believe that this thing's going to replace the person and be better than them and smarter than them? And maybe eventually we'll get to that point. But I think for the foreseeable future, we should be, embracing tools that allow us to be a smarter and better version of ourselves and spend more of our time on the things we do differentiated and well, which is, the decision making and the synthesis and the pattern matching, and less on the manual work of actually having to kind of go through an unstructured set of conversational data just to kind of get to that first point. Like if you look at like the AI copywriters and the AI tools like Jasper and Copilot AI, a lot of the problem that they solve is they kind of recognize that one of the best applications of the first applications of these AI, these large language models, is to solve the blank canvas problem. Write a prompt and then let me just kind of like fill it out and get it, 50% of the way there, 60% of the way there. And it's getting better and better over time to getting closer and closer to an actual polished result. But at least for the foreseeable future, it's more of an augmentation to the, processes that we're doing as knowledge workers and less of a replacement.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So when you start thinking about like going downstream then and looking at end users who, when they receive this information, again, that it needs to be accurate, there needs to be a source of truth. Kind of coming back to that piece, how would you say, or why would you say transcription accuracy is so important in this case? And specifically to the point of large language models, kind of what we're discussing here, how does that all correlate in your mind?
Yeah, good question. Everything in statistics comes down to garbage in, garbage out. So depending on the quality of your natural language processing and your, speech to text, that's going to impact the quality of your analysis and the quality of your entity detection of like, is this the same person in this call that's in that call? And all of this stuff is evolving really, really fast. And I know a lot of the audio intelligence APIs that you all do we're either actively using or actively working with, and they can help us to, I would say, deliver that end user value faster, so that you're tying together those entities across the system that the user is in, or that you're able to accurately get names right, or I think we even ran into the one the other day where it was inaccurate on its pronouns, and we were like, well, we don't want that, because a lot of times names are gender ambiguous. And so I would say the accuracy and the thoughtfulness of the transcription, that's the first layer that then ultimately becomes what gets ingested into the large language models that are powering all the AI output that is extremely useful. It is growing. At no point does the screen data currently enter into the large language model. So whether or not I was smiling, or whether or not I was frowning, or whether or not there's a mountain behind me, or whatever it might be, and that's all data that we as human beings use to infer our conclusion, to drive our conclusions and our inference. But none of that is currently what is going into the large language models. That will change if you look at what just released with GPT-4, which has definitely some cost challenges to it, but that is actually going to change. But right now, I would say that, to answer your question directly, it's all about garbage in, garbage out. So the higher quality your transcript is, the higher quality your analysis is, your summaries are, your synthesis, all of that work, not just for the large language models, but also for the person. So I would say transcription quality is something that always comes up in our user feedback. It always comes up as like, either this is so good or this is terrible. And it will be about the exact same transcript outputs. So a lot of it's in like the eye of the beholder, and how and what their use case is and how accurate they need it to be. But I would say in general, as a rule of thumb, like the accuracy of the speech to text is, it's hard to find something that matters more in terms of feeding, I would say, the analysis and the output and the value. People talk a lot about how times they want like higher video resolution in our recordings, but that comes up at like an order of magnitude lower than, it really matters that the actual content of the speech to text is accurate.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and we really would, I would say, adhere to that as well, to where that's why we put such a big focus on, when we start iterating across our models, it all starts with our automated speech recognition. With
Mhm.
as soon as the more that we can drive that accuracy up, the better the downstream results are for any other product that you're building. So I think that's really insightful with how you're thinking about that. And really that's where you'd mentioned this before about how you're using different models and endpoints with that. So I'm just kind of curious, like, how are you, if you don't mind to elaborate, then like how are you currently using Assembly AI, and how does that play into the grander scheme of things for you?
Yeah, really good question. So the primary use case is it's our core transcription provider. So
Mhm.
we have done, I don't know, many different bake-offs across the day, across the years. And we always evaluate, I would say our first criteria is our customer's first criteria is that accuracy. And then right behind it, I would say is finding a provider that's like philosophically aligned with the future. Because what you don't want to do is have to like rip out your systems if another provider is able to, I would say, at the API level, it can save us a ton of engineering time and cost, and we can move it into the right place of our kind of data pipeline. Um, I would say transform the information into an output that we want to render on the AI, or sorry, on the UI, or that we want to, I would say, feed into the other systems or tools that we're using. And so that's, I would say, a big part of what's always gone into our bake-off is it always starts with transcription accuracy, and then then it's quickly followed by, I would say, the supplementary services that can come along with that transcription and can be processed in the same time. Specifically, I know that the dictionary and being able to like build up custom dictionaries. So we have a workspace based product to where a team at a large company or an entire company for a smaller company will adopt our product, and that it's very important that they get that. So, for example, if without kind of a custom dictionary, it's very common that a word like grain, our product name, will get interpreted by the speech detect as green or rain or some other variation that sounds like grain but it's not grain. And so
Mhm.
that then starts to feed into the garbage in garbage out at a disproportionate amount because it's the name of our company or it's the name of our customer's company, and it comes up all the time. So if grain is shows up as 7 different permutations, you then lose that ability to, I would say, synthesize and kind of pattern match at that aggregated level across a bunch of different recordings, because you're not consistent in the naming of those entities. So that is something that we're actively working on with Assembly AI, in addition to some of the other, I would say, audio intelligence services that y'all have.
Yeah, and that's perfect. And then I ultimately, when reviewing that information, what would you say led to the switch to Assembly?
I wasn't in charge of the bake-off, but it's primarily driven by, I would say, our last decision of our transcription provider was driven almost entirely off of cost per hour.
Mhm.
And after a lot of times the quality wound up being pretty similar, but it was, I would say, once we were like, okay, well, these folks all have a similar level of accuracy, the next criteria we really were using was cost per hour. And so I would say I don't think we're like really different than where we were at before with Assembly. I think it's about consistent where it was. It's just that the last time that we were in, it was like dramatically different. We had to commit to quite a bit of volume to be able to get like a really low price per hour. But I would say it's gotten to the point now to where, the competitive pricing, and then you add in some of the other elements that we've talked through. And that was what led to the team making a decision. I didn't actually make the decision. I just inherited it, but I think it was, one I support.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And coming back to like the philosophy side, we're excited to see, these things that we're pushing towards in the future. New updates to ASR, one of them, and expanding actually into new partnerships in the AI space that can help with a lot of this growth and things that you're speaking of. So that kind of brings me to where, how are you seeing AI help Grain's customers better understand and communicate as a whole? I know we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but it'd be great if you could maybe
Yeah.
dive into that into more specificity.
Sure. I think the two things are more time listening, less time getting distracted with the busy work of annotation and indexing.
Mhm.
Um, which means you're going to have better conversations with better output and better, learnings that come out as a result of it, or better sales results. And so that's number one. And then the other time is just, I would say, more time in the synthesis and I would say conclusion, decision making, influencing, and less on the busy work of having to kind of spend your, like, I personally save so much time. We've only released, I think, the AI summarization like a month and a half ago.
Mhm.
And I've only had access to it a couple of weeks longer than that. And I have completely changed the way that my behavior works from really relying on this like kind of manual thing that would distract me a little bit from the live meetings, to being like, yeah, it's going to be good enough for me to rely on, to where I can quickly go and find that part that I want to, where I can quickly, distill the essence of this conversation with another stakeholder. And that's just less time that I have to spend copying and pasting and doing and rewatching calls that, like, I frankly have. No one really has time to rewatch calls. Like, you're spending the time, I would say, consuming information from others, or sharing the distilled bits of information with others. That leads to the actual knowledge work that you're doing, because you're trying to build an awesome product that's aligned around the needs of your customer. And
Mhm.
all of this stuff, it's just important to remember, it's just a means to an end of building something and collaborating as a team, and aligning around reality of what our customers want and need. And so that is, I think, the main output is less time on some of these, low level tasks, and more time on the high level tasks. And again, it kind of builds on that augmented intelligence point I was making before, making us smarter as knowledge workers, as
Yeah,
individuals and as teams.
yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So moving to the future, then, what kind of features do you maybe have in your roadmap that you're probably most excited about, especially in the space of AI? Where do you see Grain moving in the future as this expands?
It's exciting. I would say, like, what's wild is what that would happen is, this is like a full-on platform shift. Like, in the same
Mhm.
way that mobile phones put GPSs in pockets with the internet, in a way that you couldn't carry your personal computer to the curbside to have a car come pick you up, right? The platform and the protocol fundamentally changed the applications that could be built on top of it. And so um, that was mostly a two-part. The mobile revolution was really like two platforms, I would say. The computing revolution in terms of operating systems, there's just a couple of platforms, obviously Apple, Mac OS, and and Windows, and you've got some open source there as well. But there really kind of tend to be like a couple of different platforms, but then a bunch of things get built on top of that. And so what'll be really interesting, and I think is going to be really, really critical, is that we have more players than just OpenAI, because even a lot of the like other protocols and APIs are really using that large language model underneath their hood. And so, like,
Mhm.
most of either the services are using it, or we're using it directly. And I think it's going to be really important that we have a healthy ecosystem, and I believe that we will. I'm personally extremely disappointed that OpenAI isn't nearly as open as they said that they were going to be, and I definitely have a lot of skepticism around having the, I would say, keys to the kingdom and control of like one, real institution. That, what's been interesting to see is like Microsoft with their partnership, just has this massive head start on startups, on Google, on everybody, because of that partnership with OpenAI, that they're able to like work with these APIs way before everybody else is. So I think it's going to be like really important that there is a healthy ecosystem, and that there's multiple platforms that are ultimately that are being built on. But what's
Mhm.
different this time is that there isn't going to ever really be a visibility to the end user of, is this powered by Google's Bard, or is this powered by GPT-3, GPT 6.5? Like, it's increasingly going to be more and more opaque to folks who are just kind of getting the output of these things. And so there's similarities to these other platform shifts, but I would say it's uniquely different as well. And it's going to be very interesting to kind of see how at that platform level it really plays out with these folks that have large enough data sets that they can actually make meaningfully compete in the LLM world. And
Mhm.
then, that's kind of half of it. And then the other half of it is like, okay, let's assume we have a healthy ecosystem. Like, the applications are going to be just, I think, pretty wild over the next couple of months. In the next 6 months, it's going to be I would say pretty mind-blowing. And then I don't even know where it really necessarily goes, too much beyond that. But I think in the same way that Bing is currently competing with the index, search engine web page indexing that Google dominated, in the search engine market. And now all of a sudden Bing is getting a similar set, or a different, I would say a more curated set of results that they can show you based on a query. That same thing is going to play out, I would say, in most applications in terms of search. You're less going to be searching for an index or a pointer to a thing, and you're more so going to be like searching for an answer that then can be in human, I would say, readable format, custom to your specific data set, give you an answer that is, again, you have to be skeptical of to a certain degree, but I would say is probably going to be pretty directionally accurate and really useful when it comes to leading you down kind of the next step of discovery that you need to go on. So I would say that's probably the first one that comes to mind, is this similar play from, pointing to links to actually providing answers that's happening in the search engine market. That's going to be, Elasticsearch is probably still going to have its use, but it's going to be a lot more of, answering questions in human readable output format, as opposed to pointers to be like, oh, is this the thing you were looking for? Go look at it. It's just like we've actually synthesized across a lot of different, pieces of data that are in this context window. And here is the end result or the conclusion based on the prompt that was fed to it. That's just one of probably 15 different things I could, pontificate about, but the applications are pretty exciting.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see where things go, especially in the future, and as companies who are really taking this AI first approach and thoughtful approach, how you're describing, you'll see what they make. And so really, I would love to get your thoughts on how you see, kind of stepping back outside of Grain, but just looking at the AI landscape as a whole. Where do you really see this kind of moving forward to potentially in the next? Really, I was going to say like couple of years, but that may be too far. Maybe it's moving much more quickly. So love to get your thoughts on that.
Pretty wild time to be alive.
Yeah.
I mean, my immediate answer is augmented intelligence over artificial intelligence. And it's really easy to get caught up in the paperclip problem if folks are familiar with it, but it's this idea of like, ultimately you're designing these systems that are, kind of maximalist in nature. And then when they can program themselves, it's not a hard argument to say that these systems in many ways are already, or like thousands degrees more intelligent than us, but in other ways, they're not nearly as intelligent as us. So I think it's pretty, I'm not the person to, pontificate about the philosophical underpinnings and the ethics of AI. I would say I am definitely worried about it. The one thing I would say there that is, there's this book written by a woman named Kathy O'Neill. She wrote a book called Weapons of Math Destruction. And this is just kind of the next chapter in the book. I don't remember her writing about like large language models. This is, I think when I read this book, it was 2014, 2015 or something. But she talked a lot about like the dangers of algorithms. And in particular, one of the, or I would say an algorithmic approach to outsourcing human cognition and decision-making. And then that becomes the thing that is unquestioned. And then now, as a result of it, you completely lost your human agency. And so I definitely worry a little bit about that type of work. Like, for example, the college, reporting and ranking in US News and World, that is super messed up. And it is completely hijacked and ultimately ended up being just like an algorithmic approach to ranking colleges. And that's what people use as their decision-making criteria of where to go. And that's what admission, teams are looking for to try to recruit students, because we're 3 points higher on this like arbitrary world report. It was really just anchored off of the bias of what was fed into it in the first place. Same thing goes with, recidivism and policing and using big data across any different area. It's just now all of a sudden we're in a place where it's actually even, I would say, more concerning to make sure that we don't outsource our cognition, our decision-making to these, AI oracles that we think are smarter than us. Like they are in some ways, do things we absolutely could never do. But in other ways, I believe that we continue to do things that, they will never be able to do. And I don't know where that ends. I'm not going to be the, person that that pretend like I've got it figured out over the next 100 years. But I would say in the near term, I think AI would be a very meaningful force for good. And it's going to be just important for us to, use it in the right ways to augment what we're doing as opposed to outsource it. But we kind of know from historical precedent with human beings that we tend to kind of take the path of least resistance, and and in that it's to believe what the AI says as opposed to checking its source material. And I would say the more visibility that the system, that's what we need to demand, visibility into the source material that these large language models are using to produce, a set of recommendations or synthesis or analysis, so that we're always able to trace it back. Because as soon as we lose that, I would say, reference to reality upon which these things are based, we start to enter into a pretty dangerous period. So exciting time, but I think also a lot of unknowns. And I would say what I know for sure is that the more we stay rooted in reality, we demand that of the products that we use, and we're not just believing in the black box. I would say the better outcomes that we'll have as teams, individuals, society.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Appreciate your time, stepping through all this. I really wanted to, before we head to Q&A, just step through like a quick lightning round, if you will.
Sure.
So just run through some questions quickly, and then just kind of first thing top of mind. We can go from there, and then we'll answer some questions. But looking back at everything you've learned kind of over your career and over the years, what's the one skill, habit, kind of anything you'd really boil down in that category that you'd want to take back with you to if you were going to start over? What would you want to start with from day one that you maybe do now?
It's the emotional intelligence to know and to believe in yourself and against, I would say, the group or the crowd, and when to recognize when you're wrong and you should be learning from the data that's in front of you. Because the paralysis happens between those two worlds, where and I would say bad outcomes happen, where you think someone else has got the answer. And saying, going back to the AI question, you're like, oh, well, I don't know, the AI knows, so let me just do what the AI says. Like, we do that with people all the time. We do that with advisors, investors, whoever. And I can look back and it can sound kind of cocky or arrogant, but I feel like I try to really approach every situation I'm in with as much humility as I possibly can. And sometimes that can be a double-edged sword, where you're like, well, they know more than I do. But a lot of times they don't, or they're not as invested, or they're not, they don't necessarily have all the context that you have, especially if you're like, at that executive level or founder level where you have an ownership over an outcome. You have to collect the primary data and then ultimately trust your own decisions. Like, the worst decisions that I've made that I wish I could go back and teach this lesson to a former version of me have been either on the arrogance of I'm right, or on the other side where it's like, oh, I don't know what I'm talking about, that person must be right. And usually the best path is trying to find the balance in the middle, where you're evaluating all of the objective reality in the data and then making your own conclusion and then sticking with it. But it's danger territory as soon as you start outsourcing that, because the person you relied on is not ultimately going to be accountable in the same way that you are. Yeah.
What would you say that the AI tech that you're most excited for is at the moment?
I just live and breathe and sleep and eat in this world of conversational intelligence. So I would say, I feel very lucky to be a part of this movement, and in an authentic way, to where, we've been waiting for, I would say, solutions that can deliver this end value to our users for a long time without having to build janky machine learning, not as good language models inside of our own company. And that, I would say, has been something that we're fortunate to be well positioned. And it's the area where I'm focused on. So sorry, it's I wish I had another area where I was, outside of what we just talked about, that I'm, super excited or obsessed with. But right now, this is 98% of my cognitive cycles.
No, I think that's perfectly fine. No judgment at all. And then the last one, what is one book that has influenced your career above all others?
Oh, above all others. There's always recency bias in this question as it gets asked, but I think the most recently that for me has been The Effective Executive by Peter Drucker. It does not age well in terms of, I would say, the I would say inclusive environment that we work in nowadays. So that's a bit of a disclaimer, but it does age well in terms of its like principle-based thinking and an understanding of what it takes to be an effective executive and to hire and work with other effective executives. And I think it was written in the 60s. Ultimately, like Andy Grove and a whole bunch of other, pioneers of Silicon Valley, most of them were influenced off of Drucker's thinking. And that's something that I've been going back to again and again, almost like it's a religious script, because there's just so much wisdom baked into it.
Your source of truth that you've mentioned before.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate the time that you've taken here. I want to move to some questions now. So just a reminder, please be sure to put that in the question box in your control panel. We'll definitely get to them as we can. But just go ahead and get started. This one actually starts off for you is, what would you say is your long-term vision for Grain, Mike?
Gartner released a study in like 2019 that I was like, yes, there's an objective market research firm that is saying the same thing that I believe for a long time, which is that I think they said 2025 was the year where 75% of conversations will be recorded and analyzed. I think it's going to be higher than 75, and I think it's going to be sooner than 2025. So I hope Grain obviously plays a big part in that. I think we're definitely in the early innings of it, but that is, I would say, a description of where things go is there is a massive over-indexing. I would say the majority of the time, there's certain circumstances where you should be extremely cautious about what gets recorded. Most of the time, we're boring, right? I think we're giving ourselves a little bit too much credit. We're like, oh my gosh, but I can't record that. It's like, it's so benign, it's so boring, it's so like 98% of it is so useless. And so I think it's going to be just building on that, just crazy that we didn't have a record of all of our conversations unless there was an explicit reason not to, around personally identifying information or HIPAA or some of these other things that are very important that we are very careful around. But if it's just like a customer giving you feedback or a sales call or a team meeting, like we're really not that interesting. I think we over index on the sensitivity of whether or not there's a record of it, and that is, I think, the thing that's going to be a big change in just the behavior of what's normal. I've already seen a dramatic change in the 4 years since I started Grain, and over the next 4 years, it's gonna, I would say, just accelerate.
Yeah, and actually, I have another one from Walter. This is to both of us, but I think you can kick it off. Is, we mentioned this earlier, you actually advocated for it, but where do you see AI, large language models, evolving to within the next 1 to 2 years? And do you think there will be a consolidation towards only a few big players like OpenAI driving this type of innovation?
Yeah, sadly. I mean, the rich will get richer in this world, whether we like it or not. And I'm not exactly sure the role of government intervention. All I can say is our bank failed 2 weeks ago, and my faith in government dramatically, went up. I'm not exactly a cynic, but I think a lot of times, it's easy to knock on the man. But it'll be interesting to kind of see the role, that government will need to play. Like, these things are constantly changing. What we know is that oftentimes government is very, very behind. But things like the FDIC, that these financial institutions and policies we put in place from 1929, they're pretty dang well oiled and working the way that you'd want. And there's obviously a lot of incentives, and not everybody's going to agree with what I just said. Like, a lot of people are angry and call what happened to bail out. And at the end of the day, they were protecting depositors, protect the system. That's at least my point of view. And we're able to continue to make payroll and serve our customers as a result of a well-structured, I would say, banking system. And it's going to be interesting to see the role of government in this world as it evolves. All I know is they're going to be behind the times. They're going to not necessarily have a full grasp of what's happening. I know there's a lot of antitrust work that right now that's happening around breaking up Google, and it's just like, you're 10 years too late. and the reality is also that it's a pretty competitive market. And so a lot of times things get politicized in a way that makes it tough. But the reason I bring up government is because corporations oftentimes have proven that they're not necessarily the best, at self-regulating either. So it's a tricky balance, and I'm not exactly sure, and I'm definitely not in a position of power or influence to see how these things play out. But obviously OpenAI I hope they change their name to something that's more realistic to what they are. But OpenAI will continue to, I'd say, be the dominant player in the space, and it will be really interesting to see if Google can kind of finally make an actual, meaningful step in this space, or if there will be another party that will emerge. But right now, even Microsoft is, they're playing by partnering with OpenAI as opposed to, they're kind of a build versus buy. They chose to buy as opposed to build. And what I know for sure is it's really, 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 really expensive to do what these folks are doing. It takes a lot of capital, it takes a lot of compute, it takes a lot of data. And ultimately, like, there's not very many institutions that have access to all of those things. So it is not, I would say, set up to be a very open, highly competitive ecosystem, at least based on the inputs that I'm seeing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I would add to that in the sense of I think what will be important here when the question focuses on where do you see this evolving in the next 1 to 2 years, is to your point of the augmented piece of it. How are people using this and using it responsibly to drive meaningful products? We actually just launched a partnership with Anthropic from a large language model standpoint. In the way we, they've been great. We're really excited to see where that goes, but really it just comes down to exactly what you're saying. It's like, how are we thinking about this partnership? How are we thinking about these features? How are we making sure that we're putting out the highest quality output that really matters to our end users, so that they're getting that they can move forward successfully in their day-to-day lives. Whether that expands out beyond other players and by how much, I don't know if I have the answer to that or expertise to comment on it either. But I do think a big piece of the field is going to be how just echoing what you said. How are we really thinking about this as builders and people deriving it, downstream products?
Yeah, at the end of the day, a lot of the stuff can be reverse engineered, and the pace of innovation is insane too. So there's absolutely smaller players like Anthropic and Cohere and others that I think what you're going to see is there's some areas where they'll cede ground and be like, all right, well, for whatever cost reasons or data access reasons, that is not the area that we're going to be the best and win. But there's, going to be an entire ecosystem that will be loosely bucketed under AI that is maybe large language models are the output of what, is that they're feeding as an input, or the large language model will be the output that becomes an input to another system. And so we're going to see, I would say, a set of ecosystems evolving. And even, the API players themselves are building a set of APIs. It's not just, the large language models. It's really text completion is what's the actual documented in the docs. If you're, going to read about what everyone's all excited about, it's really just one of the APIs, which is text completion based on the prompts to use statistical inference to kind of fill out the form. And that is just part of an ecosystem. And I would say there's going to be tons of room for different types of players who are on the cutting edge and can, I would say, lean into their competitive advantages based on when the window of opportunity kind of opens. There's this book I read recently called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And in the beginning, towards the beginning of the chapter, I just love this. Everybody talks about Apple and Steve Jobs all the time. And so I was actually shocked there was finally something that was like a Steve Jobs Apple related thing I'd never heard before. And it was specifically about when Steve Jobs came back into Apple, and he was specifically questioned around how are you going to win? How are you going to turn it around? And he had all these management principles of we're going to streamline. And so they cut all sorts of lines that they weren't doing. But the reason he did that was to stay alive, to wait for the next big thing. The next big thing. He says, I don't know what it's going to be. and some people, human innovation and human progress is always going to ensure there's going to be the next big thing. And in that case, it was ultimately what ended up being mobile, the iPhone, but it started with the iPod and that digital revolution of music. And that was really what put Apple back on the map. And they went and they did it better than everybody else. And so I hadn't ever really thought about Apple's strategy from that perspective of a little bit of okay, we're in this market, we have a right to play, but we might not have a right to win yet, or in this dimension. And so it will be it's impossible to predict markets. And so I would say that the people who win are probably going to take a thoughtful approach like that, where they recognize that this plus this plus this is right in their intersection of expertise that gives them a right to win. And maybe that ends up actually being an even bigger thing than the wave that enabled it. But that's probably a little bit more of my macro thoughts around how things will play out, but not exactly sure.
No, sure, appreciate it. Well, last one, because I know we've gone a little over, so we'll wrap on this one. I think it plays into your field quite nicely. Is um, do you have any thoughts on maybe how this type of technology will really impact like face-to-face meetings in the sense of maybe like expanding into FaceTime or other more casual environments, or do you think this will be something that's more geared towards the workspace?
I think that ultimately it will absolutely impact the way that we do that consumer works, especially when there's an advertising model on the back of it. There's going to be when there's a mix of what consumers want and an opportunity for advertisers to reach an audience of those people. I'm absolutely confident the large language model will play a role in some application where that will play out as true and will turn into a very large, big company. I would say the area that I tend to focus on is a lot more in the B2B world, because there's a set of existing behaviors where there's alignment between the value that can come from the existing work with customers and team meetings and whatever else. And as that shifted more and more towards the digital world versus the analog world, it's definitely been good for, I would say, our market share. But for the first couple of years of Grain, I tried to overfit everything to be like, let me pull out my phone. Let's make sure we're using my product and we're dog fooding this in-person conversation. And as time has gone on, you kind of recognize that some tools are really, really useful in some applications, and in others, it's like theoretically useful, but in practice, it's more hassle than it's worth. And so I found that, when I'm valuing in person a lot more than I did over the last couple of years. And it's just a different means of communication. And the medium is more effective in some ways and less effective in others. It's all trade-offs and balances, but I haven't really found a lot of situations where I'm like, oh man, I need to pull out my phone. We did have one yesterday. We were collaborating, we're working on a brainstorm, and I said, hey, why don't we grain this? And it was really useful. I'm not sure if we'll go back and we'll reference it, but it was the type that we were like, yeah, this is a discussion, this is a presentation of information that we want to have a record of, where a lot of times just more ephemeral or problem solving type of conversations are just, there's not as much there to turn into useful content or even to analyze. But that could change over time as the tools we use and the applications that we expect that our consumers expect change.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking the time, a little extra time as well, and for all those who are joining for being here today. Really appreciate everyone for being here. And just to quickly reiterate before we sign off, we'll include this link in the sign up link, so we have the recording tomorrow, and we'll be sure to follow up with any questions that maybe we didn't get to and help answer that as well. But Mike, thanks again for your time. It was great chatting with you.
Yeah, it was awesome. I really enjoyed it, and hope to do it again sometime.
Perfect. Likewise.
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone. Thanks for the question. Bye.